Thanks very much, John. And it's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone in the audience about a topic which has been gaining momentum over a number of years and is certainly challenging both the governments around Australia, but also operators of all sizes when thinking about what the transition to a zero emission fleet looks like for everyone's different businesses. It's suffice to say that some of the international jurisdictions, as we've heard, are more mature than we are in Australia, which provides a lot of learnings. And certainly the presentations that we've just heard from Bruce and Jeff, and before that, David gives us some great insights into the different technologies, but also some of the more important data around financial implications. And what I'm hoping to do today is do a few things. One, provide my views on why I think this is important for operators to really start to act on this now. Highlight some key uncertainties that I think need to be resolved. And when we're thinking about financial implications on a business, when we talk about uncertainties, that to me translates into risk and therefore into potential financial impacts on businesses. I think if we're talking about any transition for any organisation, then understanding a plan of how to approach that, I think is important. So I'd like to touch on my thoughts for a plan on a page to help businesses think about it. And then I want to focus on some of the commercial and financial implications as a result of transitioning from a diesel fleet to a zero emissions fleet or even a hybrid fleet. And consider some of the financial implications for your business. And hopefully when I do that, put it under some of the categories that connects it with the way in which funding sources from government consider how they provide for financing on a gross cost basis. So probably the top reasons why I think this is important. Governments are unsure of how they will approach the transitions to zero emission buses, and there's an opportunity for this industry to engage with government, and certainly within Sydney, I know the team are engaging actively with Transport for New South Wales and in other states around what that transition might look like and how the industry can partner with government to ensure that transition is a smooth one for the industry and ultimately for the customers. Outside of a system implementation, I think this is going to be the most significant transformation project for a bus business. It will touch every part of the business. It'll touch the back end operations. It'll touch the fleet, the drivers, and the CapEx programs. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not a small transition for everyone's business. And I think with all the new emerging technologies that we've heard, the operational and financial implications, including the key risks, are not yet fully understood. And that means that all the research that's going on, all the learnings that are going on, and all the trials that are going on need to be thought about and discussed in these forums to help operators manage the transition over a number of years. And to suggest that it's going to happen over a number of years, it certainly will, even if we look at the way in which government are approaching the transition, moving it from a 2030 to a 2050 timeframe, acknowledges the challenges that this transition is going to have, not only on the supply chain, but the operators as well. I think it's reasonable to say that the supplier ecosystem is emerging, but not yet mature. If we think about the discussion on hydrogen versus electric, the supply chain goes right back to the energy providers and along the process to get that into the vehicles and then onto the road and delivering the operations out to the customers. But it also extends to the end of life. I think if we look at the ecosystem around the secondhand market for batteries, I think that's an important one when we think about the ecosystem and the supplier system around zero emission vehicles. It's also clear to say, and in my experience, that the current contractual models may expose the operator to financial risks during a zero emission transition and ongoing provision of services. And I think that's because it is an emerging space and governments are grappling with how to not only fund the transition, but also the ongoing costs associated with running a zero emissions vehicle, and that's when we talk about transition, we're talking about the infrastructure at the depot, but also the funding of the fleet and the end of life of the diesel vehicle. So I think the current contractual models are something that government are going to need to look at in how they not only incorporate the contract with the bus operators, but also how they support the supply chain to ensure that the transition to a zero emission fleet is as good as it can be. And I think the knowledge of the transition and the operation of a zero emission fleet will be a competitive advantage over the short to medium term. And I think that's an important aspect for everyone to acknowledge. In a fairly mature industry, which public transport, certainly bus transport, is a mature industry. This is an area where there is change, and there is an opportunity to differentiate yourselves from other operators who don't have that knowledge and be at the forefront of change in that respect. So from my perspective, it is a competitive advantage for operators to not only have knowledge of, but how to operate a zero emission fleet in the various environments, from a metro to a regional operation, and understanding the benefits of both a hybrid approach as well as a hydrogen or an electric approach, and how that may change over time. I mentioned that there were some key uncertainties from my perspective when I look at the financial implications and how to understand that. I think technology choice is pretty critical for businesses to focus on. The technology solutions are evolving rapidly. Obviously the cost of the technology is coming down, the cost of the vehicle is coming down, the solutions in relation to electric and hydrogen and hybrid are emerging, and there seems to be differing preferences both from an operator perspective but also a government perspective. So technology choice is going to be important. If you do a big bang approach, it may not be necessarily the technology choice of governments moving forward. So it's really important that certainty around which technology is the right technology for the nature of the operations and the nature of the buses that we deliver in the various jurisdictions that we deliver it. Technology timing is also pretty important around that. If the timing of the transition is likely to occur over a shorter time, and there is still some technology uncertainty, then that may impact on the risk during that transition. It's clear that the transition is not going to occur over a short term, but over a longer term, especially with the cost of investment in the diesel fleet and the cost of the infrastructure change at the depots. So technology timing is a critical uncertainty, I think, for all operators to be aware of, and that transition program is likely to take place over a longer period of time. Price parity is always forefront of the mind when we're thinking about financial implications. At what point will the whole of life costs effectively support that transition away from a diesel fleet? When we look at the whole of life costs, we do have to think about what those whole of life costs mean for everyone's individual organisation, and the cost of that diesel fleet moving out as well. But on a pure diesel to zero emission OPEX CAPEX discussion, price parity has certainly come down in the recent years, and any ways in which revenue can be considered in the supply chain to reduce that price parity point is something that every operator and the supply chain can consider. For example, the cost of electricity back into the grid, or the sale of second-hand batteries at the end of the useful life in the vehicle. And I think the contracting approach and the service delivery model from government is something that is still a key uncertainty from my perspective. What government approach will government take, not only in procuring and contracting the services, but also supporting the industry during transition. If I think about what I wanted to touch on next, and I think it tries to reduce the uncertainty around this, is how do operators start to plan for this? When I work with my clients in any transition, I think research is a critical activity. Not only researching through attending events like this, but also talking to overseas and international operators and other operators around the country in understanding the trials that have been going on, and trying to identify the key suppliers that are going to support businesses in that transition. Then taking that and analysing that with respect to how your operations will change as a result of the introduction of zero emission buses, as well as identifying what the key operational and financial risks are to your business. That research and planning phase is pretty critical for businesses facing such a major change in their operations. The governments around Australia are funding proof of concept and trials to enable them not only to understand the implications from a funding perspective, but also for operators to start to understand what the implications on their operations are. Certainly support that approach, and individual operators should also be thinking about other ways in which they can start to prove a concept in terms of how their operating models are going to support not only a transition but business as usual, and that's things around your organisational structure, policy and procedures, and training of your staff to effectively manage the fleet and maintenance programs, as well as the supply chain and acquisition of infrastructure and the zero emission fleet. Moving into a transition and a transition not only in a small way but ultimately to achieving a full zero emission fleet. I mentioned that transition is going to happen over a longer period of time with the level of investment in the diesel fleet. There is a challenge around the residual value and the amount of life left in the diesel fleet, depending upon the average age in the different areas that the vehicles operate. As well as the need to invest in changes to depot infrastructure, certainly if we're talking electric versus hydrogen. There's also a fair transition project around the people and processes, even back-end ERP systems will need to support this chain, and it's clear there needs to be procurement supply chain adjustments to be made in this area. And ultimately that needs to consider how then the transition goes into business as usual. So from a planning perspective, this is a pretty significant exercise, and we'll touch all areas of operators' businesses. If I take that and think about then what the financial implications are, the financial implications are going to touch all areas of the operations. There's clear that there's going to be an impact on the scheduling and rostering of vehicles, the need to manage the spares and the peak vehicle requirements. If a bus is being charged overnight or on a 6 to 10 hour cycle, then the number of spares needed to support an operation might need to go up, and that's going to have a financial impost not only on the business but ultimately on government in relation to that. The maintenance and refurb is going to change. The different approach to the diesel versus a zero emission vehicle, the cents per kilometre is where the savings are made ultimately to achieve that price parity. But there's also a change in terms of training versus a decision to outsource the maintenance of vehicles, and there's a change in relation to the fuel and energy supply chain there, and uncertainty around the consumption and the costs. And there's also the ERP change that I mentioned before. That's going to ultimately impact on not only the commercial and contractual discussions with government, but also the way in which you look at the return on assets and return on investment in this area. The supply chain is evolving. I think Jeff was talking about Macquarie looking at a whole of life provision of fleet. That's another option that enables the organisations to consider how to finance zero emission fleet versus the existing diesel, and look at outsourcing that in terms of risk as well. If I just move on, I want to break that down and look at it in terms of the elements of the business funding as well as the costs, and look at a comparison between diesel and zero emission fleet. The impact on drivers' wages we know generally accounts for 60 to 70, if not 80% of the costs of operating a vehicle. If we've got impacts on scheduling in terms of distance that an electric vehicle runs versus a diesel vehicle, what's the impact on rostering and staff changes as a result of zero emission vehicles introduction into the network? The choice of technology and charging approach will certainly impact on the number of drivers we need to operate that and the number of peak vehicles on the road. There is a fairly well-known consumption rate on diesel fleet. There's certainly a fairly well-known benchmark around the average cost to maintain a diesel fleet. There's a fair amount of uncertainty when we think about zero emission buses, when we talk about the price of electricity or hydrogen, the battery efficiency, and the approach to charging, but also the average cost to maintain a zero emission vehicle. When we look at that, that means there's uncertainty and there's risk for operators when they're thinking about the financial implications on the zero emission transition. And certainly when looking at that in either a negotiation or a tender, having some information and understanding of what the zero emission fleet is going to cost you is pretty important. Otherwise, it not only has revenue risk, but it has cost risk as well. The distance variable elements to the business around labour and outsourced maintenance, something that all organisations are going to have to think about how to transition. Do we upskill our staff or do we outsource this? And again, the cost of to maintain a vehicle, a diesel vehicle, are fairly well known on the zero emission fleet. The operator is going to need to rely more on supplier knowledge and overseas information and information coming from limited trials. The other areas that businesses need to think about are the direct fixed costs, so registration and insurances, and also the capex cost of the infrastructure to support the buses, the approach that a regional operation or a metro operation will take in terms of either a fast or a slow charge, or having hydrogen fuel tanks on site, or a supply chain around refueling, are going to be decisions that'll impact upon investment as well as the ongoing recovery from government contracts over time. But there's also the existing infrastructure in relation to the diesel fleet that's going to need to be supported for some time, but then also have an end of life cost for removal of that. How operators are going to finance the fleet is and the transition is going to be a discussion not only with the financiers thinking about how they can support that, but also whether there are supply chain opportunities to support the cost of the vehicles, as well as the ongoing OPEX in relation to that. And that's again what Jeff was talking about in terms of the Macquarie approach there. And there's certainly going to be an ongoing reduction in the cost on the zero emission vehicles around the cost of batteries and the depreciation lives in relation to that. Finally, I think there is a significant change around the IT systems that the ERP providers are going to need to look at in terms of how they can support the emerging requirements for zero emission fleet. Probably the two other areas that I wanted to talk about is the transition program should be looked at in terms of a cost that needs to be considered over time. The two areas there around retraining of staff and policy and process change and project management over that time is going to be generally a one-off cost of transition. Businesses need to understand how they're going to look at recovery of that cost, whether it's upfront or on an ongoing recovery basis. And I touched on the fact that there is an end-of-life cost associated with the diesel fleet. When we're talking about this with various businesses, what I like to know and what I think our clients like to know is what ultimately is going to be the net financial impact on a business as a result of the transition to a zero emission fleet. And that says what are the costs that we are no longer going to incur, and what are the new costs or the incremental costs that we are going to incur, and understanding what the net financial impact is on the business. Need to understand the investment required, including the cost of transition and the return on investment as a result of that. and very much consider the financial risk and allow for contingencies in investment. When we look at risk and when we look at contingencies, modelling the impact, the financial impact across the business is critical in terms of understanding both the profit, loss and balance sheet impact, but also the cash flow impacts, and running scenarios around the risk areas is something that all businesses should be doing as they move forward through a research and proof of concept phase, to understand where they may need to adjust estimates, as well as understand whether they need to access more finance or access the cost of transition through recovery from government. So I'm just going to end there, just to enable us to have some time for questions. I think that gives us about 8 minutes, John. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you also for leaving plenty of time for questions. So let's start. We've got one here. It's labelled by the author as a left field question, but I think it's an important one. What is or what will be available to reskill workshop teams into the hydrogen space, and what sort of time frame before we see mainstream training? Now, possibly you might think that is a question that could also relate to previous presentations, but I think taking it more broadly, addressing potential skill shortages in the ZE transition, which is, I think, is something that you have hinted at anyway, Matthew. How should we better equip, I'll say, the sectors?
Well, I think there's two parts to that, isn't there? You've got the suppliers of the vehicles and understanding what's required in terms of maintenance around that. You've got then the infrastructure at the depots, and if we look at that, the need to maintain the electric infrastructure is different than the need to necessarily maintain the infrastructure around the hydrogen space. The extent to which a bus operator needs to understand what they need to maintain on a hydrogen bus, the suppliers of that bus should be able to assist in understanding the requirements of the maintenance programs for those vehicles. And then we've got a training industry, a training gap if there are not providers in the industry in terms of upskilling staff. So that's something that the industry could then look at, either through discussion at an industry level, even a government funding perspective, to provide programs around reskilling and training. If we look at some of the government programs that have occurred where there are transitions, and certainly in technology transitions, there are grants available to reskill staff where there is a legacy technology there. I hope that's answering the question that was asked. But it's a gap that will occur where there is a change in technology, and it's the suppliers of the technology will then have to start to look at what are the requirements around maintenance of that vehicle, and what are the training elements that need to be provided such that operators are able to maintain those vehicles.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. More questions coming in now. Does the finance industry have a more conservative view of the ZEB technology in comparison to diesel, or an aggressive view on the cost of money to fund these projects?
I can certainly say that the finance industry certainly understand the diesel side of financing. I think the various financiers are grappling with the nature of how the cost and the financing of the assets occur over time around the zero emissions fleet, and it's an emerging space in that respect. I think they're working with operators where needed, but there needs to be certainty of funding coming through from government to support that. And I think that's an area that there's both opportunity and risk. and operators need to be talking to financiers and helping them understand what the costs of supporting that fleet and that transition are, but ultimately what the impact on business is, because there are two elements to that. Is there a secure funding source coming through from government for the fleet, as well as does that business have the right balance sheet strength to support the transition in relation to fleet? So I think it's certainly an evolving space with financiers, and there are evolving solutions as well.
Great, thank you for that. Nick Brown asks, how would the mismatch between bus operator franchise periods and the amortization period over which large-scale energy infrastructure, such as charging, be resolved?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question, and I think when I was talking about the risks with the contracting approaches from government, where the government have a transition end of term transition agreement in terms of a depot, it's going to reduce the risk in relation to funding that. Where the operators own the infrastructure, I think there's always an end of term risk in relation to that infrastructure. How that then is recovered over that contract term is the challenge that you've got from an operator perspective, because the infrastructure is obviously something that's going to go across a traditional 7 to 10 year term of a contract, and I think that's one of the areas of risk that is emerging, and it's something that the various governments have to consider in how they approach that.
Thanks, and just your reference to various governments there, both within Australia and abroad. I think one thing that is clear is that there is, there's so much experience being garnered at a global level. Are there things that we can do to ensure that we encourage greater share of experience beyond our own jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think there is. There's a challenge between sort of longer term contracts and the recovery of that in terms of the transition cost. Government know that if they have a transition period like this, that it's going to come with some upfront costs. How that's going to be resolved, honestly, I don't know yet, John. And there are international learnings, but from what I understand, some certainty around tenure is a pretty important part of that discussion.
Great, and I think that's perhaps a good point to draw a line under this particular phase of the conversation. And thank you again, Matthew, for your presentation and for fielding the Q&A.